How you doing? As the title suggests, we're doing the suspension on this thing, finally. So I'm going to show you what it is and show you how I'll go about installing it. There's no way I can not do an install video about this, because on that previous video, the top comment by Matt Gollings was, "Please do backyard mechanics vid install." Thanks for the comment, buddy. It was the most liked comment of all. And there's even been comments since then in like all the other videos I've done that says, "When's the suspension video?" So here it is. King Springs and Koni Heavy Track Raid 88 shock absorbers. These things were very expensive at $320 per shock. So that's how we're going. I'll talk a little bit more about the spring weights and everything as I do each end of the vehicle. So let's start on the front. So before you take anything out, don't do like I nearly just did and forget to measure it. There's a few reasons. You can have bragging rights when you go to your mates and say, "Oh, my 2-inch lift brought it up 100 mil. It's sick." If that did actually happen, you might want to look at what lift kit you got. Also for warranty. So if your new suspension sags like way too much, even considering you got the right springs and everything, then you can go back and say, "Hey, look, this is where it was and now it's down here. Here's the details, here's the truth." And also you can just keep track of it over time. So we're going to take a tape measure and measure it from there, go straight up through the middle, tape measure to there. And in measuring all that, I discovered it is sagged about 15 mil to the driver's side. And I had noticed when I park it on a slope or when it's really loaded up, it sags a lot worse on the driver's side than the passenger side. But that's all going to be fixed soon. This is going to be a familiar sight through this video, because there's no hoist around here, which is good for you because you're probably trying to do it on your garage floor as well. Rather than start with a big array of tools and tell you what to use, I don't really know what I'm even going to use yet, so I'll just talk you through what I'm using as I go. Well, you won't have to take the wheels off for this. We can work around that okay. I am going to disconnect the sway bar. I think that's the first thing I'll disconnect. Hey Roger, is this the ball? Okay, next thing to come out is the shock absorber. So I'm replacing springs and shocks, naturally has to come out anyway. But if you're only replacing springs, it still has to come out. The problem you'll likely encounter when you're doing springs, if you leave that shock absorber attached, is it will reach the end of its travel before you can get the spring out of its mount. So it probably has to be detached. Anyway, 17mm spanner on a patrol to get to the top. You can do it with just a ring spanner or open end spanner, but having the ratchet attachment on the end is a lot handier, because have a look at the thing. Toot like a tiger. Up in there, up in there. Okay, if you encounter this problem where the whole body of the shock turns while you try and undo the nut, have a close look on the top of your shock absorber, and you've got the threaded bit that comes up like that. And on the top of the threaded bit, it should have a flat face, and you can actually attach a open-ended spanner onto it to hold it steady while you've got your other spanner over to undo it. It's fiddly, but you know, if you're stuck in a pinch, it helps. So now that both ends of the shock absorber are loose, you just pull it down till it disengages from the top, weasel it out at the bottom, freedom. Okay, this guy here is most of the reason why I needed new suspension, I think, or new shock absorbers. That's all the oil that's come out from a busted seal in the top of that shock absorber. Look at that. That is filthy. Makes it real loose. Oh, juicy. Yeah, so they shouldn't be that easy to compress. If it was making noise, that'd be the noise. This one is from the driver's side, and this one isn't quite so bad. Yeah, it takes a bit of force still. I might hang on to this one for a spare, but that oiling number, that's going. Ever wondered what a four-wheel drive with no shock absorbers looks like? I wouldn't want to drive that. Okay, shock absorbers are out, so now I can remove the springs. I'm going to use a pair of these. They're the Tool Pro coil spring compressors, and you probably generally wouldn't use it for such heavy duty springs. It'd be a bit of a handful, but rather than use it as the instructions say, where you hook it on like that and then tighten this at the top to clamp them down, I'm going to hook them onto the springs while they're in the vehicle and just tighten that until it sort of pulls tight, and then I'm going to jack up the vehicle. And so as I jack it up and the weight's removed, this will just hold that spring from stretching out, and then I can drop them out. That's the plan anyway. Let's see how that works for me. Okay, mounted up like so, as close to 180 degrees apart as you can get them. And now as the vehicle lifts up away from the axle, that won't be able to stretch too much further. It'll stay like that, it'll get loose in the bottom there, and then once I've jacked it enough I can just lift it out. What you need to do is jack the body of the car and chassis and everything separate to the axles. So you're not jacking off the axle, you're not lifting the wheels off the ground, just lifting the body until that spring stretches right out. As you're jacking it up, just watch out for things like your brake lines. That's not too tight at the moment, so that's okay, but you might want to temporarily remove that bolt or something. But now you can see the spring's nice and loose. So I'm just going to heave that out of there. Coil spring compressors. Whenever you're using these things, whether you're doing them up or loosening them off, use a ratchet. Using a rattle gun's a lot quicker, but don't come crying to me when one of these things flies off, cracks you in the face, and you end up with a face like a drop pie, alright? Always just take your time, use a ratchet. Another good tip, always do it a bit at a time. Some people might tell you to wear safety glasses, but more like wear a full face helmet. Alright, I said I'd talk to you about my spring selection once I got to the springs on the front, so here we go. Roger, go away. That's the old spring. King spring also, KDFR42, which is a raised coil, standard load. This is King spring as well, KDFR42 HD, high definition 4K max. And that probably actually stands for heavy duty. Rated 50 to 100 kilos of extra load. So I have a second battery under there, that's probably about another 20 kilos on the front. I've got a winch in there now with synthetic rope, so you might call that another 15 to 20, and the alloy bar. So these will be, you know, I'm pretty close to the 50, quite firm, but in my reading and adventuring around looking up spring and shock combos, they did say that the Konis are very soft, so to try and compensate for that with a heavy spring. So I think, as far as ride comfort goes, it's going to come out pretty good. Of course, I'll have to let you know later. And because it's heavier rated, it's not going to sag as much. Make sure you put your rubber coil insulator back on the top. It goes on the top on the GU. And make sure the spring goes in up the correct way, obviously. I think it'll only go in one way. Almost forgot to mention too, which one goes where. Is there a left and right? Yes, there is. There is a very slight height difference between these two. See, this spring's a little bit taller. That will be the driver's side. In the case of King springs, you can see RH for right hand. But if they're not marked, the taller one always on the driver's side. Okay, that's the driver's side front spring in. I guess you don't need to see the whole process for the other side, so time-lapse time. Cool, new springs are in. Looks a bit taller already, but we won't measure it just yet, not until the back's in. Before we go back there though, I've got to put those new Koni shocks in the front. That's pretty easy, so let's do it. Okay, we just assemble this the same way as the old shock was assembled. So that bad boy goes there, and then on either side of the shock mount of the car, there's another one of them. So one of these goes, and then it slots into place, and then that'll be sort of where the car part sits, then that. Now funny enough, once this bit goes on top, Koni give you 2 nuts, and you're supposed to somehow wrangle both of these nuts onto there, and well, they give you 2 nuts per end, so 4 nuts per shock absorber, and then you're supposed to lock them against each other. Okay, as you can see, I've put it all back together. Now take note of how tight I've done it. You don't want to squash that thing too much. If you pancake it like a 12-year-old's chest, it's going to deteriorate really quick. So you just do it up tight enough so that it's all stacked together. And then down the bottom here, you can see Koni give you 2 nuts. 1, 2. Instead of using a locking nut, you just get 2 spanners and tighten one that way, and it locks them both off. Oh, look at that. Front end is done. It is time to turn the Patrol around and do the back. That ass! It's time to lift it. Sway bars we will disconnect. Disconnect the shocks there, and up the top they use an eye system. The back here instead of pins, and pull the shocks out. Sway bar links down the back here are just the same, bit harder to get to. 14mm nut on top of there. Disconnect that, and we're on our way. You don't need to see this whole process, so time-lapse mode. Here's a few things I found out while I was getting the shocks out and the sway bar disconnected. First of all, disconnect the sway bar down here, not up there. Much easier. Second thing, when it comes to the top of the shock absorber, it's right up in a tricky to reach spot. It's 19mm. 19mm nut holds it at the top and at the bottom. So rattle gun for the 19 on the bottom, nice and easy. On the top, I had to get the long breaker bar with a 19mm socket all the way up there. Just break it off loose, but there's not enough room to really maneuver a ratchet up there, so you're better off if you've got a 19mm ratchet spanner. That's the tools that'll get your shockies out. Now for the springs. So the thing about GUs, and actually I think most Patrols in general, is they got a shitload of flex in the back and not so much in the front. Now with the rear coils, they're about 2 times as heavy as the front ones, and the coils themselves are like that fat, just too thick for my coil spring compressors. So with the shock absorbers removed, I think that extra flex in the back, I should be able to just jack up the body and there'll be enough flex there for those coils to practically fall out. Let's test the theory, because it always works different in practice. Well, it's working, but I have another problem. Looking good. Not looking so good. Now I've got one option. I've got to bring it back down, back it out of the carport, and roll around in the gravel and put the new springs in. And then check out my lift. Sick. Something I didn't mention before. Come have a look at this dodgy thing I'm doing. Mate, that is the most backyard mechanic thing you'll probably see on this channel. Now, I'm no genius, but I know better than to get under this vehicle supported by that. So, axle stands. Mint. The axle stands will obviously, in this instance, not go under the axle, but they'll go under a point on the chassis. I might need to bolster them with a few bricks. I don't know if I have axle stands tall enough for this. Okay, as promised, I'm talking about the new springs for the rear as I get to them. Look at the difference in these things. Actually, look at the height difference in that. And now this one, it's kind of sagged to one side. Yeah. Anyway, that is a KD PR43 King spring, and this is a KD 58 LP. Interesting thing actually, when I looked on the King Springs website, this is actually a GQ Patrol spring up to the year 1997. And this one here, the 58, is a GU Patrol rear spring. This was a raised comfort coil designed for no load. So not ideal for me with a set of drawers, and most of the time the camping gear always loaded. This one is a raised comfort coil rated 150 to 250 kilo load. So I estimate that I am 150 kilos with the drawers, fridge, all the camping gear. So I'm thinking by the time it's loaded up with all the water and clothing and stuff, I'd be pushing 250 kilos, and this is hopefully the perfect spring. But yeah, very interesting how that's supposed to maybe be a GQ spring, especially as that has a flat top on it. This one does not. So maybe that was causing me some grief. Alright, the new springs are in. It was as easy as I hoped because I jacked it right up, and there's just so much movement in the rear end of a Patrol that with those sway bars disconnected, watch that brake line again, I had to disconnect the diff breather. Better remember to reconnect that. And once it's up in the air, I literally just put my hands in and lifted the old springs out, dropped the new ones in. So it's pretty hard for you to see what I'm doing when I do it anyway. Just like with the front springs, King springs are labelled left to right. If your springs aren't labelled, you just choose the highest of the two springs. The highest one, again, in the driver's side. With all springs, one more thing to know. See that stepped bit there? Generally in your spring mount on the GU, it's down on the axle end. There's like a little step in the mount. So you just got to make sure the end of this lines up with the step. Here's the new Koni shocks for the rear. These things are adjustable rebound dampening, I think. And I couldn't figure it out. Like, I had a look at the instructions they come with, and it's just one of those diagrams that kind of indicates what to do without words. It took me forever. So I took these into the shed, and once I figured it out, I made a little video which I'm going to put up separate on how to adjust a Koni Raid Series 88 or 90 shock absorber, because if I couldn't find it on YouTube, I'm sure there's plenty of other people wondering how to do it, so I'll put a separate link in. Anyway, as with all shock absorbers, give it a few cycles when it comes out of the box. Get the oil moving. I actually had a seized one once, a Blue Max brand shock absorber in Jake's old Surf. We were putting them in and couldn't even move the thing. It was just seized straight off the factory floor. So give it a few ins and outs before you whack in these rubber bushes in the top and bolt that onto the bottom. I'm going to completely flip my shit here in a minute, eh? On the last shock, on the passenger side, the top pin mount for the shock absorber up on the chassis is a bitch to get to, but I've got it on. Sweet, all good. Now we come down to the bottom, and the axle on the Patrol rolls forward a little bit, so the pin kind of faces down. So you've got a shock coming nice and straight like that, with your eye nice and straight, and a pin sort of on a little bit of an angle. That's how you're trying to align the pin. So I've been pushing this thing on there, and it got stuck part way. Pins like this, the holes like that, won't go the whole way. So I worked into the dark last night because that rear left shock absorber got so stuck on the axle mounting, and the reason is because I honestly got a little bit lazy. Often when you pull the old shock absorber off, the mounting pin is covered in corrosion and all sorts of crap, and you'd clean it off with like a wire wheel and a drill or something, but I got lazy and then it got stuck. So I was there for a while bashing around with a hammer, Eventually managed to get the half stuck shock back off, got a file and cleaned it up, and then it went on reasonably easy. Still not easy, but easier. Anyway, that leads me to the next part. I don't believe you should measure your heights as soon as you've put it all in, because as you saw, I jacked the back of this thing right up, and it sort of puts a lot of stress on all the components and moves all those suspension arms to spots they don't really see very often. So when you put it all back down, things are sort of under a bit of torsion and twisted up. So what I did was, I took it home last night, drove around the streets a bit to settle the suspension, and I've taken my measurements, so you might be interested to know what they are. Now in the front we came at 20mm on the passenger side, and we came up 40mm, or 45 actually, on the driver's side. And then down in the back we came up about 20mm on the passenger side and 55mm on the driver's side. Now before I did this suspension, I could very clearly see that it was badly sagged to the driver's side, so those numbers explain that pretty well. I could expect a little bit more settling to occur over that time. So yeah, definitely gained a lot of height. 40 or 50mm down this side, and then 20mm on the other side. Importantly, it sits level now, and it doesn't look ridiculous. Parting thoughts. Look, if I wasn't filming this thing for you guys, I would have handed it to a shop to do. I think they only charge a couple of $100 for a suspension install. It's probably worth saving the hassle really, but if you do want to do it, now you've seen a few tips and tricks and maybe you feel inspired to take on your own, go for it. On that note, if you have picked up a few tips and you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down button twice. Can't go wrong. Subscribe to the channel, enjoy some more videos, and I'll see you on the next episode of Backyard Mechanic.